Okay, good day to everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, depending where you are in the world. Good evening, indeed, to some, including our speaker. We'll get to that. My name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow here at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center in Jerusalem. And I am the host of a series of events that we hold in English, that we've been holding on Zoom in English for the past few months. Usually on a Wednesday. Wednesday is my usual slot for English events. But this is a special event that we have on a different day because it suited the event and the speaker better. Let me just say, before I introduce him, a couple of preliminaries. For those who are unfamiliar with the format and who are new to this, I'm going to have a conversation with our speaker lasting around 30 minutes, and then the floor will be open for you to ask questions, which you could submit via the chat box at the bottom of your screen. And our speaker will happily answer those. Let me also say, I'm going to write into the chat now my email address. If you want to receive emails from me about all our English events, I will just let me know, email me, I'll put you on the mailing list, and you'll receive those. We have something this Wednesday marking the anniversary of Menachem Begin's yahrzeit, about the Begin doctrine, which is the doctrine that in Begin's name, which came from his decision to attack the Iraqi nuclear reactor in 1981, and which essentially says that no country that declares the intention to destroy Israel will be allowed to acquire the means to do so. And that we'll hear from Herzl Makov, the president of the Begin Center, who was also part of that military operation in 1981, and also from Yaakov Katz, the editor of the Jerusalem Post, who wrote a fine book detailing Israel's attack on the Syrian nuclear reactor in 2007, which was obviously a subsequent implementation of the Begin doctrine several years later. Okay, so to today's event. I am very happy, excited, honored to be here with Ben Freeman, who will be talking about his new book, which we'll hear about. Ben Freeman is a Jewish leader, a Jewish thinker, and a Jewish educator. He was born in Scotland. He is a gay Jewish author and an internationally renowned educator focusing on Jewish identity, combating anti-Semitism, and raising awareness of the Holocaust. He worked for 5 years for the UJIA, which is Britain's leading Jewish charity raising money for Israel. He was a leader with RSY Netzer, the Reform Movement's youth program. He's interned at the Abraham Fund Initiative here in Israel, and he's spoken at countless Zionist organizations, including Students Supporting Israel, the Hasbara Fellowship, and Hillel. He's currently based in Hong Kong, and it is about midnight there. So we're grateful to him for joining us when he should probably be in bed. In Hong Kong, he heads up the humanities team at an international school and lectures on anti-Semitism at Hong Kong universities. Through his work, he aims to inspire, empower, and educate both Jewish and non-Jewish people from all over the world. And he is here to speak to us about his new book, Jewish Pride. Ben Freeman, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be here. It's wonderful to be, particularly with the Menachem Begin Heritage Center, when obviously he was such an unapologetic Jew, and that is something that we're trying to encourage with, or rather I'm trying to encourage this with this book. So very fitting.
Indeed, and I think that's what made the book very pertinent for us and appealing for us is that you talk about Jewish pride, and I think what's very refreshing about the book is the way you talk about anti-Semitism as something which is the problem of anti-Semites and not the problem of Jews. I want to read a very short quote from the beginning of your book, which I think is really indicative of the message that I got from reading it, and then go into some questions. you write, we have a choice. We can reject who we are, or we can reject the non-Jewish world's idea of who we are. In order to heal our collective self-esteem, we must have Jewish pride. That is not to say we should isolate and ghettoize ourselves. Rather, we should interact with wider society, but we must do so proudly. So with that in mind, what do you think, what makes this book different from other books about anti-Semitism? There's a whole lot of books about tackling anti-Semitism. What was missing from the market in your view? What did you need to stress that was not there before?
I think the thing that makes this different, and even different from David Baddiel's book, which was published perhaps a little annoyingly this week as well, is that all of the books focus on what is done to us. It focuses on external identities imposed onto us. And this book is very much about the opposite. It's about our identities, our responses to these phenomenon. And I think that is really the thing that most writers on anti-Semitism miss. They don't seem to acknowledge, they don't seem to recognize, actually, it's not our problem. It clearly is a problem which impacts us and impacts us very severely, but it is not a problem that began within our peoplehood, within our community. And no one seems to recognize that. And in many ways, it's quite obvious. You would never say to the gay community that homophobia is a gay problem. You would never say to women that misogyny is a female problem. But Jewish people, and also non-Jews, but particularly Jewish people, we seem to take on the responsibility of anti-Semitism. And I think that is not appropriate. And I don't think that it's healthy.
Right. No, I think that's a great point. And I like, there's a few things you do in the book which I think are really interesting and different certainly from what I've seen. One of the things that you do quite early on is that you identify two different potential audiences for the book, which you suggest should take different things from the book, different messages maybe from the book, different lessons. One is for Jewish readers and one is for non-Jewish readers. Can you say something about that? And perhaps also for this audience, as we're here in Israel, at least some of us, I wonder also if there's a third category of reader, which is the Israeli Jewish audience. Can you answer both of those points?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that we discussed the other day. So with regards to what's actually in the book, which is the note to my Jewish reader and my non-Jewish reader, and those notes are in the introduction and the conclusion, because clearly Jewish people and non-Jewish people will take something different from this. Jewish people are going to learn about their experience, their identity. It's going to challenge them in a very personal, emotional way. It will also challenge non-Jewish people, but in quite a different way. It will hopefully lead them to look inside themselves, look at their own internal bias, to think about how they can be allies. But the reason I have a note to my non-Jewish reader is I want Jewish pride to be a movement that empowers Jews and non-Jews. And I think there is a problem in some social some social justice communities that speaks with judgment. And it speaks with blame. And I think when you recognize that a problem is systemic or deeply embedded or institutional, that then makes it clear that actually the individual is not necessarily responsible. So it's about empowering people, empowering non-Jewish people to look inside themselves and to see perhaps where they have absorbed non-Jewish perceptions. And with regards to the Israeli reader, I do think that Israelis will have perhaps a different response to this, or rather even diasporic Jews who have made Aliyah and who live in Israel, because they're not living in the non-Jewish world. You know, mostly I talk about the non-Jewish world. I mean, it's probably one of the things I say most in the book, and that does not actually apply to Israel, but I still think the lessons do. First of all, we're all part of a wider Jewish community. So the Israeli community is not separate to the diasporic Jewish community. We're one people, we're Am Echad. And secondly, the anti-Semitism which targets them, which is usually to do with anti-Zionism, or at least the anti-Semitism that targets the Jewish state, is anti-Zionism. But that is still rooted in the same classical anti-Semitic tropes that have existed for thousands of years and that still target us in the diaspora. So while some people like to make a distinction between the anti-Semitism or the anti-Zionism that impacts the Israelis and the anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism that impacts us, there is no distinction. They're part of the exact same story. And I think fundamentally with Jewish pride, one of the most important things is reunifying and rebuilding the Jewish people. You know, we have an unbelievable opportunity with the internet to really connect with one another on a global scale. And that has to obviously include Israel, the Jewish state, but also Jews in the diaspora as well.
Right, and perhaps you could say something more, a little more about, and this is obviously a topic which has been covered by many people, but I think your take on it might be particularly interesting. You mentioned, as others have done before, about the way in which anti-Semitism arises in different forms, has done over history at different times, in different contexts. And one of those forms that it takes today, of course, is anti-Zionism. What's your take on that? Because it's often this is often something that's disputed. You know, there's often a lot of debate within the Jewish world where the line is drawn between criticism of Israel or where legitimate criticism of Israel rather than anti-Zionism. Anti-Zionism itself, is it anti-Semitic in and of itself, or is it something which leads to anti-Semitism? What's your take on it?
My take is a very clear and strong take. And this was part of the process in writing this book, was finding my voice and not being afraid to make strong statements. So, spoiler alert, I think that anti-Zionism is a form of anti-Semitism, and that is not something I'm willing to debate. I'm also a Holocaust educator. I've been talking and teaching about the Holocaust now for about 15 years. I will also not debate whether the Holocaust happened. I will not debate with a Holocaust denier because there is no other perspective. There is no other side to the argument. Anti-Zionism, in the way that we know it now, is a post-Holocaust form of anti-Semitism that was specifically spread by the Soviet Union, who essentially they won the propaganda war. Now, criticism of Israel. Criticism of Israel is quite tricky. And I think that we as Jews, we have to accept a bit of responsibility for the confusion regarding criticism of Israel. So criticism of Israel is not inherently anti-Semitic, obviously. Israel, like any country, can and should be criticized. However, when speaking to the non-Jewish world, and actually I think we do this to be palatable, we do this to show that we're reasonable, we're willing to engage, we're good Jews, basically. We often say anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic, but criticism of Israel is not. And actually, there has to be more nuance there. While criticism of Israel is not inherently anti-Semitic, it is absolutely true that it can be anti-Semitic. You can criticize policy in an anti-Semitic way. So, for example, the accusation that Israel purposely kills Palestinian children to steal their organs. Someone might say, well, that's a criticism of policy. Firstly, it's not true. And secondly, it's rooted in blood libel. So that is criticism of Israeli policy or criticism of an imagined Israeli policy. It doesn't have to always be a real policy, but criticism of an imagined policy that is anti-Semitic. But regarding anti-Zionism, and that is a form of anti-Semitism, we shouldn't debate it. And we also have to be very clear that Jews who are anti-Zionist have internalized anti-Semitism. I won't describe them as self-hating Jews because I think that also requires more nuance, but they absolutely are suffering from internalized anti-Semitism.
Interesting. Could you say a bit more about that? What you mean by internalized anti-Semitism?
Absolutely. And I think it's really funny, actually. Well, not haha funny, kind of odd funny, that Jewish people never want to admit that this is an issue which affects us, which is really bizarre because it literally affects every other minority. There is a huge amount of academic literature regarding internalized anti-Black racism. And actually, in my book, most of the academic literature I lean on to kind of frame this argument, this discussion, is from the Black community. There's also huge amounts of evidence, at least anecdotal evidence, of internalized homophobia within the gay community, within the LGBTQ+ community. So it seems kind of insane that the Jews would be the only minority that do not suffer from this kind of internalized prejudice. And the reality is, for as long as anti-Semitism has existed, there have been Jews with internalized anti-Semitism. So take Tiberius Julius Alexander, who was the second in command at the destruction of the Second Temple. He was a Jew, and his father donated the gold that was used to construct the gates of the temple. The first blood libel case in Britain was in 1144. It was based on around the murder of a young boy called William of Norwich. That was in 1144, as I said. And in 1150, a monk called Thomas of Monmouth came to Norwich to record the case. And his writings, his reporting leaned very heavily on someone called Theobald. Theobald was a Jew who converted to Christianity. And Theobald made up the most unbelievable lies that said the Jews meet in the south of France and they pick a name out of a hat, and that's the community that they were going to target. And they do this to punish the non-Jewish world, to punish Christ, because they chucked us, the Romans who later became Christians, they chucked us out of Israel. So firstly, having meetings in the south of France is a lot nicer than having meetings in the Prague graveyard that the protocols say that we're doing, but equally, they're fantastical. And that was said by a Jew. Mm. And the reality is, when we are considering Jewish identity in the diaspora, we have to understand that we're considering a group of people who are a minority, not just in terms of how they're treated, but in terms of the numbers. So in Britain, there's about 60 to 65 million people. There's about 250,000 to 300,000 Jews. So it's not an equal power dynamic. And that leads sometimes Jewish people to internalize anti-Semitism, to internalize the shame, to be embarrassed about our identity, to frame ourselves, as I said, as the good Jew to be accepted. And that is what Menachem Begin was against, and it's what I'm against. And it's, no, we have to be unapologetically Jewish. We shouldn't be apologizing for our Jewishness. We shouldn't qualify our Jewishness.
Right. No, I think that's right. And it's interesting also, there's a whole other breed of Israelis who've internalized anti-Semitism as well, which is a separate thing. People like Ilan Pape and people like that. In the book, you have this very interesting discussion about the differences between integration and assimilation, and separation is another response that you give to. And these are all responses or potential responses by Jews to anti-Semitism. Can you speak about what's the difference between integration and assimilation, and which, in your view, is preferable? Which is more indicative of Jewish pride?
Absolutely. So they are all forms of acculturation, and acculturation essentially is how a minority interacts with the wider society. So you can assimilate, which means to shed your identity. So if a Jew went to the United States and they wanted to assimilate, they would shed their Jewishness. Integration is when you maintain your Jewishness, but you also join the wider community. So you say we'd become a British Jew or an American Jew. I guess it's the hyphenated identity. And to be separate really means to live in an isolated way. So we could look at maybe some of the religious communities that live in New York. I think we have to be quite clear that assimilation is kind of the antithesis of Jewish pride, actually. Giving up your identity to be accepted, to fit in with the wider society is rooted in shame. It's rooted in internalized prejudice, and it's absolutely not something we should encourage. We should encourage integration. I know that some of you in the audience are from Israel, so this is not necessarily a question that applies to you, but I know that there are some people who still live in the diaspora in this conversation. And if we live in Scotland, where I am from, then I have to be a Scottish person. I have to, carry out my civic duty in Scotland. I have to be part of Scottish society, but I can do so as a proud Jew. They're not mutually exclusive. So what we should be encouraging is, if we live in the diaspora, integration, because I think that is the right thing to do, whilst maintaining a strong and proud Jewish identity.
And what's the role of religion in this? Because one of the big debates in the Jewish world, of course, is between, in Israel, of course, you have religious secular Jews, but there it's a little different because identity plays out in a national context. But in the diaspora, we have denominational Judaism, Orthodox, Reform, Conservative, and others. And I know that you were active in the Reform movement when you were younger. I'm not sure how you identify today, but what's the role of religion? Because certainly Orthodox Jews would say, we have the answer really to this question of integration rather than assimilation, of keeping hold of our Jewish identity whilst fitting in to the broader, to the general public, modern Orthodox, should we say, rather than ultra-Orthodox. What's your take on that?
Well, I would say that to answer that question, we have to actually explore what we are. And the idea that we are just a religion is ahistorical. It's not true. It's never been true. And actually, the only reason we adopted that specific identity was to circumvent anti-Semitism. In France, after the revolution, after, you know, Napoleon came in about 1806, Napoleon called an assembly of French Jews and he said, so are you French or are you Jewish? If you were going to fight with an English Jew, would you see them as a brother or would you see us as a brother? And they said, of course, no, the French are brothers. Like, we don't want to hang out with those English Jews. We're French friends. And what they essentially did was drop their nationhood, their peoplehood, this aspect of our identity that we had maintained for literally thousands of years in an attempt to circumvent anti-Semitism. So the role of religion has a role. And I think if people choose to be religious, if people believe in God, then that's great. And they should be encouraged and supported in doing that. But I think there also has to be recognition that not every Jew necessarily practices the religion or feels close to the religion. I can speak for myself. When I do Jewish things, religious things, I'm not doing them because of God. Like when I'm saying Kaddish for my late father, I'm not doing it to exalt God's name. To me, that's not something I'm interested in doing. What I'm doing is honoring him in a way that Jews have honored their dead for thousands of years. So there is a blurred line because we express our Jewishness, even we express our peoplehood through maybe what could be perceived as religious acts. But I guess the intent is important. So religion has a role to play. But if people feel proudly Jewish and are not religious or not observant, then that's also okay. And I think we have to create space for that.
Right, and that's great. And I think also, you know, speaking from Israel, of course, and as someone who made Aliyah, I would say that Zionism is another way of expressing Jewish pride. I think that's, and you know, and it's not. I think it's not for nothing that the Zionists, so many of the Zionist pioneers and people who founded the state and thought up the state were not religious, and but nevertheless had this strong national Jewish pride, or people who are Jewish pride that you're talking about. I'm gonna one last question from me, and then I think we'll see if we have some questions from the audience. There's another very interesting categorization that I think you do, where you actually divide into quite substantial chapters for categorizations of anti-Semitism, which you call the blood libel, the economic libel, the conspiracy fantasy, and the racial libel. Can you maybe briefly sketch out what those are, what you mean by those characterizations? I think they're really instructive.
Absolutely. And they were born, categorizing anti-Semitism was born out of the constant, never-ending conversation about which is worse, left-wing anti-Semitism or right-wing anti-Semitism. And I have to say that is an enormous waste of time, that conversation, because what it's doing is starting in the middle of the story. When I teach a class, I start at the beginning of the story that I'm trying to tell. So that is explaining just what anti-Semitism is, regardless of who is expressing it. So there are 4 categorizations, as you said. The first is the economic libel, and that essentially is the notion that Jews are obsessed with money. But each of the libels, we always have to understand, what are they really saying about us? Because it's not just that we love money, because I think everyone loves money. So that's not necessarily an accusation that can just be levied at Jews. It's saying something else. It's saying something that we are perverse, we are immoral. Why? Because where did it come from? It came from the accusation that Judas sold Jesus out for 20 or 30 pieces of silver. So Jews would sacrifice personal relationships to get some money. So then that frames us as completely immoral. So hold on to that idea of Jews being immoral. The next one is the blood libel, which is rooted in the accusation that, well, I mean, it was an ancient accusation, but it really emerged after the Roman Empire converted to Christianity with the accusation the Jews killed Jesus. Obviously, the Jews did not kill Jesus, the Romans killed Jesus, and we were a handy scapegoat. But this again created this notion that Jews are perverse, ultra evil. If we could kill Jesus, who is the Lord, then we could kill anyone, including children. Conspiracy fantasy has always been an aspect of anti-Semitism. The accusation of blood libel is obviously anti-Semitic. Remember what Theobald said, we're all gathering in the south of France in Biarritz to pull a name out of a hat. That's not just a holiday, it's a conspiracy. And it's really this idea that the Jews are trying to control the world. And lastly, it's the racial libel. And this is not something that we as a community talk about enough. It is demonization or judgments based on ideas of Jewish shared ancestry. And the Nazis obviously famously did that, but also what happened during the Spanish Inquisition, where they classed Jews who had even converted to Christianity as having dirty blood. But it's also demonization of the physical appearance of Jews. So we have to recognize that there are many Jews who do not fit into Eurocentric beauty standards because we're indigenous to the Levant. So we are shamed not just through the Eurocentric beauty standards, but through 1,000 years of shaming of one specific Jewish physical characteristic. And I'm sure that we can all understand what that is. It's our noses. And one example of anti-Semitism can be all 3 or 4 if it depicts a physical Jew. So it's not that each example is neatly categorized. It's one thing can be many. So for example, the mural that was drawn on a wall that Jeremy Corbyn supported, even though it was obviously anti-Semitic, that featured blood libel, it featured economic libel and conspiracy fantasy, and ding, 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 it also had a racial libel. And I think this is the best way to categorize anti-Semitism, because it then allows us to see the fact that no matter who is saying it, they're basically saying the same thing. So while the right wings will say, you know, those damn Jews are controlling the world, the left will just handily score out the word Jew and write Zionist. But essentially it's the same thing. So I think the conversation on, you know, categorizing anti-Semitism via its source is quite reductive. And I think that these basic categorizations, and obviously it's much more complex than this, they will help people just understand our experiences, because I don't think that we have done a good enough job about educating ourselves about actually our experience. And one of those, the part of our experience is understanding anti-Semitism.
Right. I think there's something wonderfully indicative about Jeremy Corbyn, that when faced with something which actually comprised all 4 of these categorizations and therefore was perhaps the most unambiguously anti-Semitic thing you could possibly imagine, he still didn't recognize it as anti-Semitism. Okay, I'm going to. Sorry?
He was there, but not involved.
Indeed. Indeed. Let me turn to some questions from our audience. I'm going to read one out this is from Jonathan. I'm going to read it out just as he's written it. He says, I've been in Israel for just over 7 years now, so perhaps I see this through a foreign lens. But what I've noticed over the last few years, on social media at least, is a trend where Jewish pride and publicly coming out as Jewish is no longer a taboo, particularly within Jewish students in the UK and the US. But in many cases, this quote unquote Jewish pride is counterbalanced by actively rejecting Zionism in Israel. Is it from a small but vocal minority or a worrying trend? And if it's a trend, what do you think can be done to counter this phenomenon so that we can reestablish identification and empathy with Israel as a major part of Jewish pride?
I think it is a trend. I think it's probably still at the moment, hopefully a fairly small but loud minority, but it absolutely is a trend. We saw it in Britain with Jews who supported Jeremy Corbyn. We kind of nicknamed them the As a Jews, because they would begin all of their sentences with, as a Jew, I support Corbyn, or as a Jew, I don't think he's anti-Semitic. And we're certainly seeing it on campus in Britain and America. And ultimately, this is why we should never use the term self-hating Jew, because these are Jews who feel that they're proud Jews and feel that they are basing their Jewishness, their Jewish identity, their Judaism on Jewish values. The value they are basing it on is a misunderstanding of Tikkun Olam. So it absolutely is a very worrying trend that's taking place. And I think that the way we combat it and guard against it is by just recognizing that A, it's internalized anti-Semitism. And I think naming something is very powerful. And then we guard against that internalized anti-Semitism by educating properly, making sure that people understand our authentic identity. So understand that we're not just a religion, but that we're also a people, and that people have a nuanced understanding of Israel. Because I totally agree with Jonathan. I think that Zionism is an integral part of Jewish pride. You cannot separate one from the other. You actually can't really even separate Zionism from Jewishness or Judaism. They're too much entangled. But I think it's about creating a culture of empowerment and making people see the realities of Israel, because a lot of these people, these young Jews who identify as anti-Zionist, what they've done is just swallowed all of the lies from the non-Jewish world. So Israel becomes to them racist, white supremacist, colonialist, imperialist, and it's just not true. So we have to counter that with education, showing the reality, making sure all of these people know that we're indigenous to the land of Israel. And actually, the only reason we left is because we were chucked out. And then for 2,000 years, it's not like we had a barrel of laughs. You know, people have to understand our true experience and not just see the world through their lens. And I gave a talk the other day to a very privileged, very wealthy private school from Los Angeles. And it was with the parents of the Jewish parents of the school. And one of the parents said, how do I get my child who goes to this very good school, who is privileged, who has never personally experienced anti-Semitism, to understand anti-Semitism is a growing and global problem? And I think ultimately what we have to do is, and this connects to this idea of rebuilding a people, is reinvigorate, rebuild this notion of a global Jewish community. And a Jew anywhere being attacked should be a problem for all Jews. So while so-and-so from that specific school may be very lucky, and I would also say quite rare, not experiencing anti-Semitism, that doesn't mean that there is not a much bigger picture. But ultimately, it has to be through education.
Okay. While we're waiting for some more questions to come through, I want to ask, there were a couple of questions that I had about your personal experiences. One is, so at the moment you're in Hong Kong, and I believe you've been there for a while. Mm-hmm. So as I understand it, you are teaching about the Holocaust and anti-Semitism to largely or exclusively non-Jewish students. Is that right? Exclusively, yeah. Exclusively non-Jewish students. So maybe you could give us a little, given that I believe that everyone in this meeting is Jewish, though I may be wrong, but maybe give us a little hint as to what you would want non-Jews to take away from the book, and perhaps how that also plays into what you talk about in your lectures at university. I think what I want them to understand from this book and from my classes is our, as much as you can in a 3-month class or just reading a 320-page book, our kind of historical experience. Mm-hmm. The non-Jewish world have perceptions of Jews. Often they're perceptions of privilege, of power, of wealth. And if they talk about anti-Semitism, they'll talk about the Holocaust, because unfortunately the Holocaust has been, I think, very poorly taught. And maybe because of time constraints, but what has happened is that people generally start in 1933 and end in 1945. So most non-Jewish people think that the anti-Semitism ended in 1945, the war ended and everything was wrapped up. And actually, that is obviously not true. We had anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism for the Soviets. We have what we're experiencing now. But also the Holocaust, while it was this, kind of freak incident in terms of the scale, in terms of the process, it was also a continuation of 2,000 years worth of anti-Semitism. And that's really important. We cannot teach the Holocaust in isolation. You can't teach any aspect of Jewish identity. So what I would want non-Jewish people to understand is our historical experience, but I don't want them to see us as victims, because we're not victims. I think that the Jewish people are kind of miraculous. The fact that we are Jew, I mean, I'm going to plug my own book, but the fact there is a book about Jewish pride in 2021 is pretty remarkable, considering that 2,000 years ago we were expelled from our homeland. Like, that's pretty insane, but it's not an accident. The reason there's Jews today fighting to continue Jewish life is because the Jewish people have an undying, unending commitment to our Jewishness. And while we have experienced unbelievable persecution, we have also created unbelievable and incredible, thriving, beautiful cultures. So I want them to see us as more than just, the sum of our persecution, but as whole people, and understand that we're also not a monolith. There is this idea that one Jew speaks for everyone, which, for the Jews in the room will obviously understand that's just absurd, because you have 3 Jews in one room and you have about 35 opinions.
Like I always say, like, no, there's not a consensus, I promise. But the most important thing is that the arguments are our arguments to have. I want non-Jewish people to be empowered. I want them to come along for the ride. I want them to be allies, but they also need to understand their role. And when Jewish people talk about their experiences, it's the job of non-Jewish people to listen, to ask clarifying questions, but not to challenge us. Not to be like, are you sure? Did that really happen? Because that is, you know, incredibly disrespectful, and it's a form of gaslighting. But I want Jews and non-Jews to go away feeling educated and inspired and empowered, perhaps empowered to celebrate their own Jewish identity, or empowered to become an ally to Jewish people. Because one thing I will say is, and we said this at the beginning, anti-Semitism is not a Jewish problem. So if we're ever hoping for anti-Semitism to be eradicated, then it really has to be done by the non-Jewish world. So we are in desperate need of allyship. But as proud Jews, we're not going to beg for it. We're going to demand it. And I think we're also going to call people out when they don't. This was something I personally did in the summer. I saw on Instagram, when you post a story, you can see who sees it. And I obviously post a lot about anti-Semitism, and my non-Jewish friends, by and large, were silent. And then when the Black Lives Matter movement started, they were all posting their black squares, which was a sign of support for Black Lives Matter. They were all posting about it. And I messaged people and was like, what are you doing? Like, do you think, like, I know that you're seeing my post, so why are you saying that my experience isn't important as this other thing that's happened? And I think that those conversations aren't always comfortable, but it's part of this being unapologetic. I'm not going to accept it. I'm not going to allow non-Jewish people to be my friends, to be in my life, if they're not going to support me, if they're not going to support our people, because we're experiencing a struggle and we need support.
Do you think that that reaction by your friends, my immediate thought was that this is an indication of what we sometimes read about, where anti-Semitism is this kind of acceptable prejudice in a way, because Jews are quote unquote a privileged minority. They're not the, you know, then this was talked about a lot in the British case, as you know, with Jeremy Corbyn and the left-wing anti-Semitism in the UK, that Jews can't be the victims of racism in the same way that Black people can be the victims of racism, because, you know, they're wealthy, middle class, successful people. So it's, you know, we don't need to include them in our sort of pool of people to be protected from discrimination.
Yeah, absolutely. It's this idea that we're privileged, we're powerful. People also have a very binary view of what prejudice is. And right now in the world that we live in, prejudice is almost solely based on the color of your skin. So they'll look at someone like me and be like, you're a white guy, regardless of how I identify. So they say, well, you couldn't possibly be a victim of racism, but anti-Semitism is a form of racism. Right. And, you know, someone said on Twitter earlier, there was a conversation about this endless conversation about are light-skinned Jews white? And it's, you know, and I do address it in the book, but actually it's kind of irrelevant, because has the color of our skin ever saved us from persecution? No, it hasn't. So it doesn't really matter whether you consider yourself white or not white. The anti-Semites are still going to hate you. I kind of hate to break it to people. But yeah, it's this notion that we're privileged. And I say in the book, and I've talked about this with my students, the idea of privilege is not really something I think that we should be continuing with. Not to say that the ideas behind it aren't important, but the use of that specific word. Firstly, telling a Jew that they're privileged is actually quite triggering when we're told constantly that you're rich, you're powerful, and you're privileged. It's quite hard to disconnect that. But also, when we talk about privilege, it's often used to denote an immovable status. You're privileged, you're oppressed. And it's much more complex than that. And one person can experience both, in that, using that language, oppression and privilege at the same time. So what I do in the book and what I've tried to do with my students is say, we should talk about advantage and disadvantage. And instead of saying you are privileged, you say you are experiencing an advantage. Because I experience advantage because of the color of my skin, but I also experience disadvantage because I'm a gay man and a Jew. And the reality is life is complex. It's never black and white. It's always shades of gray. But yeah, this concept of punching up prejudice and Jews being rich and powerful is very damaging. But that in itself is an expression of anti-Semitism. So they don't support us because they think we're rich and powerful, but they think we're rich and powerful because they're anti-Semitic. So it's this like never ending cycle unless you break it. And I have quite uncomfortable conversations One of my best friends is in this call, and we talked about it, and she's actually right in my eye line, Jessica. Hello. We talked about it a lot because actually it was very distressing. It was very distressing to see all of our non-Jewish friends, or many of our non-Jewish friends, raise their voices and speak up quite rightly in support of the Black community. And I'm not criticizing that, but to see them totally silent when we are raising our voices up, it's not acceptable.
It leads me to another sort of very current point, which I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on, which is what happens when anti-Semitism comes from another minority group. So in the US, this has been quite current with anti-Semitism from within the Black community, and it becomes a very problematic situation, especially not only because there's a proud history of Jews and Blacks fighting anti-Semitism together, and racism and anti-Semitism together, but also because it makes it much more difficult to sort of win the hearts and minds of quote unquote progressives when they see their, for want of a better phrase, victims of choice, the Black community, calling out Jews and Israel, Zionists as well, of course, for discrimination.
Yeah, and I think that actually not only does it make anti-Semitism harder to deal with, but that perspective is inherently racist. Assigning an identity to one specific community, say it's the Black community, and saying you're oppressed, you're victims, that is deeply disrespectful. There is brilliance and success and potential in the Black community, just like there is any other. And there are Jews who can be anti-Black racist, and there can be Black people who can be anti-Semitic, and there can be LGBTQ people who can be anti-Semitic also. I talk about that in the book. And I think that we have to start rooting our discussions in reality. And I understand that we want to be sensitive. We don't want to necessarily increase prejudice through our discussions or through attempts to combat prejudice. But I absolutely think that we have to talk in real terms. So I, as a gay man, am not going to not talk about anti-Semitism in the LGBTQ plus community just because LGBTQ plus people are often deeply oppressed or persecuted. We have to call out, and yes, we have to be sensitive, and we have to make sure that our conversations, our calling out, does not veer into that specific form of prejudice, so homophobia or anti-Black racism. But I think that we should expect the same standards from every person. And we shouldn't assign people identity as, oh, you're oppressed, therefore everything you do is fine, or you're an oppressor, so everything you do is awful. It's much more complex than that. And it is difficult, but I also think that it's about unapologetic. It's about unapologetically advocating for ourselves. We can advocate for ourselves. Jewish people can stand up and we can talk about our experiences, and we can focus our advocacy on our own community. And we're entitled to do that. And we have to combat anti-Semitism from wherever it comes from.
Right. And you mentioned, just to change tack a little, you mentioned the LGBTQ plus community, and the book's called Jewish Pride. And when we think of pride, especially pride with a capital P, we think of pride parades, we think of the gay pride and the LGBTQ plus community. Can you just explain to us, especially for those of us less familiar with that community, with that world, what did you take from the experience of the sort of fight of the gay community for acceptance? What did you take from that into this way of thinking about anti-Semitism and Jewish pride?
I mean, quite simply, I couldn't have written this book if I had not been already on a pride journey. And I think that's why this book is unique, is because I really believe that a heterosexual Jew could not have written it in the same way. Firstly, in the world we live in, they would be accused of appropriating. And even though actually someone asked me the other day if I was appropriating, I was like, I'm not sure one part of me can appropriate from the other, but okay. But I couldn't have written it. I have already been on a journey to pride. So when I realized that the Jewish community needed pride, and that was really born out of the Corbyn experience. And I saw the British Jewish community rise to the occasion, and many people in Britain fought incredibly hard against Corbyn. But there were also Jews who were suffering from what I call the hangover of the keep your head down policy. which was this unofficial Jewish policy of just keep your head down, get on with it, don't say anything. And I think that's wrong. I think it's unhealthy. And I also think it didn't work. But it has impacted us. And that is what led me to realize we needed a Jewish pride movement. We needed a movement that could say to Jews, actually, you're allowed to advocate for yourself. You're allowed to be proud of yourself. You're allowed to define your own identity. But modeling it on pride certainly came from my LGBTQ plus experience. But I also could look at the LGBTQ plus community and kind of evaluate it critically and say, okay, where has there been success? Where perhaps has there been failure? And one of the things that is quite a common conversation in the LGBTQ plus community is how basically the LGBTQ plus pride movement is for good-looking white boys. And it excludes people from other communities. It includes people who aren't in shape. It includes people, you know, who do not prescribe to the specific standard. And that's really damaging. So that's one of the main reasons that I chose to make diversity such an important part of this book, and why I interviewed 7 Jews from around the world, because it was important. It's always important to have progress, to move forward, to never be stagnant. So while the book is absolutely rooted in my own LGBTQ plus pride journey, it's kind of an evolution of that. But yeah, I couldn't have written it if I hadn't already been in a journey to pride and understood what that means in doing the work, because it is work. I think there's some people who think they're going to read this book and they will instantly feel pride and all of their internalized anti-Semitism will go away. And it's like a pill that you can take. And it's not true. Our community has to do a lot of work. We have to have a lot of difficult conversations going forward until the end of time about our identity, because it's deeply complex and these things are deeply, deeply rooted. I literally wrote the book about Jewish pride, and there are still times where I feel shamed. And I have to make a conscious effort to be like, no, I'm going to speak up. I'm going to advocate regardless of what circumstances I'm in, obviously, as long as it's physically safe. But yeah, I understand the work that it involves.
Do you think that there's a particular, because social media is now such a huge part of our lives, and you mentioned Instagram, but you know, many of us are active on Facebook and Twitter and other things, and so much of the debate around these issues takes place now online. What would be your advice to Jewish people who are active on social media about how to show Jewish? Would you have specific advice about how you show Jewish pride, maybe in a way that isn't seen, where you're not sort of being provocative, but you're also not being the keep your head down Jew?
I mean, in an online context?
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's about, you know, people have now started to label themselves as Zionist. People talk about their Jewish identity. People talk about the Jewish food that they eat, the Jewish culture they're engaging in. People talk about Israel. It's about having a public conversation. It's about offering representation. And I think everyone will express their Jewish pride differently. And that's kind of the beauty of it. Even though we're a tiny ethno-religious community with just 14.7 million of us, the diversity is incredible. So we all will celebrate and embody our Jewish pride differently. But it's about the feelings that you're embodying. It's about knowing that you have worth, knowing that we have worth, having collective and individual self-esteem. But I think it's about not being ashamed. And I think it's about also in an online context, making sure that you're not getting all of your education from online. I see a lot of people who are like, I'm an educator. And I'm like, I'm an educator. And I've trained to be an educator, and I'm in the classroom every day, and there's skill involved in education, and it is an incredibly difficult job. So for someone, just because they have a Wi-Fi connection and an Instagram password to say, I'm an educator, I find to be a little bit kind of demeaning, actually. And there are some people who do amazing work. There's an Instagram account called The Roots Metal, and she's actually a jewelry maker, but she does really in-depth, informative posts. So it's not that everyone needs to be in the classroom, but I think it's certainly about being, selective about where you get your information from. I see posts from people that have thousands of followers, and I'm like, well, that's just wrong. Like that, and you could have Wikipedia'd that and you'd have found out that it was wrong. So it's about being, selective and doing your own homework.
Right. Yeah, I think that's very good advice. we have another, let's say, 10 minutes. If people have some questions, please write them in. I think people are just sort of sitting and listening to you, Ben, and just enjoying the wisdom and the inspiration from you, and maybe their questions are being answered. Anyway, but you have 10 more minutes to submit some questions, guys. Let me say a couple of things. One, it's interesting when you were talking about the British Jewish community and the unofficial policy. How did you refer to it? Of keep your head low. Yeah, the closest I can recall to a Jewish pride march or demonstration was when we had a Stand Up for Israel demonstration in Trafalgar Square in London, and it must have been 2001, 2002 during the Second Intifada, and it was this controversial departure by the British Jewish community from that policy, and I was actually working for the Jewish community at the time, and I remember certain people being very uncomfortable with the abandonment of what had been the way of doing things, which was, we have our meetings with government ministers and with members of parliament behind closed doors, and we don't make a fuss in the press and all this kind of stuff. And then suddenly there's this demonstration of how many thousands of people in Trafalgar Square with Israeli flags. It was actually great. But I think I actually think it really inspired a lot of people. So that whole pride notion, I think, is something which just the physical, we're learning it, I think, now from not being able to do it in the same way in the current global climate. But just having so many people together in one place is such an inspiring and, I think, invigorating experience. And it's not a surprise to me, without being so familiar, obviously, with the gay community, that it's something which became such a major part of the LGBTQ movement.
One thing I will say is that, somebody asked me, do we need a Pride Month like the LGBTQ plus community have? And I was like, well, no, because we have Pride festivals every week. We have Shabbat, we have Rosh Hashanah, we have Pesach, we have Purim, we have Hanukkah. Our community works very differently to the LGBTQ plus community. So we have these ways that are built into our calendar and built into our way of life. I write in the book about when my father passed away, my family and I were handed a blueprint on how to mourn. We have so much given to us that we don't necessarily need to seek it out like other communities that are not kind of part of the same structure. But, with regards to what you said about people being a little embarrassed, when I first started talking about Jewish pride, I was told, keep your head down, don't say anything. And I was speaking to, I'm not going to name names, but I was speaking to someone quite recently who I'm actually partnering with to do an event at some point. So if you look up my calendar, you'll be able to see, perhaps, you might be able to guess. And they were saying to me, well, what happens if we're proud? What happens if we walk around with our head held high? And I had to be like, stop talking and listen to what you've just said. Do you see how, quite frankly, embarrassing that is that you've just said that? You would never say that to a Black person. You would never say it to me about being gay. It's embarrassing. It's embarrassing that and it's not about victim blaming. It's not about, unduly criticizing those who have come before us. We have to understand why people do what they do. And I explore the kind of emotional and wider context of the American Jewish, the French Jewish, and the German Jewish communities. But I think it's a little shameful that Jews and Jewish leaders say, but what happens if we're proud? Won't it increase anti-Semitism? And then you have to also say again, stop talking. Has there ever been a moment in time where we have caused anti-Semitism? We keep our heads down, they hate us. We don't keep our heads down, they hate us. There's a common denominator here, and it's not us. And this book, to kind of full circle, which is nice, this book is not about fighting anti-Semitism, because anti-Semitism is not our problem. It's about rejecting the shame of anti-Semitism, because while the non-Jewish world try to shame us, there is a very clear difference in being shamed and being ashamed. And we have to not let a culture of shame permeate our community. We can't control whether they try to shame us or not. That's their gig. But ours is to reject the shame and say, no, we're going to love ourselves. We're going to have collective and individual self-esteem. And we're going to reject your notions of our identities. We're not going to say, okay, we'll be a religion because you say if we're a religion, you'll be nice to us. And then, quelle surprise, they're not nice to us.
Mm.
And we're going to define our own identities. And we're not going to agree, obviously. So there'll be some Jews who say, no, this is my identity. Some Jews say, that's my identity, and that's fine. But the conversations are ours to have. And they have to be rooted in an authentic understanding of our historical experience, which means zooming out and having a little bit of vision just beyond your kind of your own life.
Okay, thank you. I have another great question here, which I want to ask. I think the speaker is from the US. He's talking about the US, and he's saying in the post-Trump era, we're living in a world where many people are supporting groups such as QAnon, adopting conspiracy theories which are often mutations of historic anti-Semitic conspiracies, and actually in the case of QAnon are actually also openly anti-Semitic. Do you see a risk of anti-Semitism becoming more mainstream in the United States in the near future?
It's not a risk. It's happened.
Hmm.
Really, we have to be very clear in this. It's happened. The golden age of American Jewry, whatever you want to call it, is over. And actually, I would argue it never really existed to begin with, but that's maybe for the sequel of my book. It's over. And this is why this book is so important. I get messages all the time on Instagram and people say to me, this is the worst anti-Semitism has ever been. And you're like, well, not ever been, obviously.
Right.
But certainly in my lifetime, this is the worst it's been. Every day I wake up and there are multiple, and I mean multiple stories from around the world with Jews being persecuted or attacked or demonized, whichever. It's happened. It happened in Britain. It's happening in America. It's happening in other places. And I think it's very important that we wake up. And part of the book is also, it's not a warning, but it's to say and kind of to shake people and say, wake up. How often do we have to repeat the same mistakes before we learn from them? The French Jewish community in the 19th century could not have imagined that at the end of that century, there'd be the Dreyfus trial, which would unleash an orgy, a wave of violence across France, a wave of anti-Semitism. The German Jewish community, who were more German than the Germans, even though the writing was on the wall to a certain extent, could not have conceived that there would have been the greatest tragedy to befall the Jewish people in modern times. We have to start learning from our experience. It has happened. Anti-Semitism has very much entered the mainstream, and we have to respond to that. And part of our response has to be also the way we deal with the non-Jewish world. But part of our response has to be pride, because it's getting worse and it's going to get worse. And unless we build up our own defenses, one of which being pride, I think it's going to be a disaster, not necessarily for Jewish lives, but the continuation of the Jewish people.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. That was a nice sort of definitive way to end, I think. Let me give you the opportunity to plug the book. It's called, do you have a copy behind you, I think?
I do.
Can you?
I can't take that one, no, but I can take another one because that would be my display.
Let's see it a bit nearer the camera. So Jewish Pride.
Jewish Pride Rebuilding a People. It is out today. It's available on Amazon and on Book Depository, and it's number 4 currently out of 20,000 in Book Depository, and it's number 9 on Amazon Jewish Studies bestseller list. But we've got to keep rising up through those ranks. So Book Depository and Amazon.
Okay, thank you very much, Ben. It's a great read. I think you've got a sense from our conversation today, just what a thoughtful and inspiring guy Ben is, and I thank him very much for joining us today. I hope you'll read the book and check out Ben. Do you have a website, Ben?
I do. www.benmfreeman.com. My Instagram handle is benmfreeman.com. My Twitter handle is benmfreeman.com. Actually, no .coms obviously in those, but I like continuity.
Okay. Okay. So find Ben on various social media. Let me just end also with a plug of my own. My name's Paul Gross. And my email is paulg@begincentre.org.il. I wrote it also in the chat. And email me if you would like to hear more about events that we do here at the centre. They are, we have a lot of great guests, some Israeli, some not, always discussing interesting topics around Israeli politics, history, the Jewish world. Yeah, we've had some fantastic guests on in the past, as today's is a good example of that as well. Okay, so thank you everyone. We're going to let Ben go to bed as it's 1 a.m. and I wish you all a good day. Bye.